My name is Naomi Klein. I'm a writer from Canada, and I want to say what an honor it is to be here in the village of Bil'in, which is known throughout the world as a symbol of resistance against violence and occupation. They're known for their nonviolent protests. And I also want to say what an honor it is to be here also with Al-Haq, which is one of the great human rights groups, and it's also been my pleasure to work with them in the past as well. We always planned, and when I was planning this trip with my friend and editor and publisher Yael Lair from Andalus, we always planned to be here for the first stop to be the Friday protests in Bil'in. But the fact that it's happening this week is particularly important to me as a Canadian, because this week in Canadian courts, the people of Bil'in are getting their day in court. The hearings began, and we heard the lawyer for Green Park and Greenmount make the argument that this was a political issue, that it didn't belong in the courts, and moreover that if it did belong in court, it belonged in Israeli courts. So what's been interesting about that, Mohammed Khatib has been on a tour in Canada. Actually, there's been a tour of people from Bil'in, and Emily Schaefer, their lawyer. They've gone to 11 different Canadian cities, and they've filled rooms of hundreds of people. It was my pleasure to be at their event in Toronto, which was a terrific success. And they've gotten a lot of coverage in the Canadian media, which is not usually very sympathetic to Palestinian people, yet they've gotten profiles in newspapers like the Montreal Gazette, the Toronto Star, the CBC. The people of Canada are learning the name Bil'in. They are, more than that, even learning the name of your martyrs, even learning the name of Bassam and his tragic killing. And really what this court case is doing in Canada is it's breaking through the propaganda barrier. You know, we hear all the time in our corporate media, which is a very, very pro-Israel media, that this is the only democracy in the region. And yet, this court case has become a way to put that claim on trial because, of course, the lawyers representing this village are arguing that their case can't get a fair hearing in Israeli courts. And more than that, we hear about what happens at the demonstrations when people in this village, joined by internationals, joined by Israelis, go on peaceful marches and are met with rubber bullets, tear gas projectiles. Even though we also learn that Israel's own courts have ruled this part of the wall illegal. So when that happens, when people are killed and badly injured in lawful demonstrations against clearly unjust acts, that's not normal. And that is being normalized here, but it isn't a normal situation. And it's situations like that that shaped my decision to come to Israel, not as a normal book tour, but in support of the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The publication of the Shock Doctrine in Hebrew is the first time that a book has been launched with an author's tour in cooperation and consultation with the Boycott National Committee in Ramallah. And what that means, and Yael can explain this to anyone who wants to know more about it, is that we aren't doing any events that are in cooperation with any Israeli state institutions. So that means that we have to have a lot of events outside, actually, not just this one. But what we're trying to do here is show a way that cultural producers, artists and writers, can not boycott Israelis and Palestinians, but not act normal. We're rejecting normalization. We're rejecting the idea that there can be, apolitical cocktail parties and book signings while violence like this is taking place so nearby. That's what we're rejecting. And in fact, we very much believe that art and culture is political, and that cultural producers should use their skills in order to highlight the resistance to occupation and strengthen that resistance. And that's why I'm so very, very proud that my first stop on this extremely non-conventional quote-unquote book tour is the village of Bil'in, because not only is this village a symbol of nonviolent resistance, it is a community that has integrated art and culture in the way that it resists. In fact, this community has turned resistance to occupation into performance art. And of course, that hasn't stopped the rubber bullets or the tear gas, but it is extraordinarily inspiring. And I want to thank you for that inspiration. It's an honor to be with you today.
Thank you.
Any questions?
A complete boycott of Israel, no Israeli products, no Israeli music, no.
I mean, personally, if I have a choice, these aren't the sandals. But I tend to follow John Berger's idea that boycott is a tactic. It's not a dogma. It's not a doctrine. And I think there has to be every attempt made to be absolutely clear that we are not boycotting Jews. We're trying to create a dynamic, which was the dynamic that ultimately ended apartheid in South Africa, which was that the South African companies, the big South African companies, were finding it so difficult to do business because of university divestment campaigns, municipalities passing divestment. This is where it really matters. It's less about the individual consumer than it is about trade unions, universities, cities, even states deciding that they're not going to do their buying in bulk from Israeli companies. That's when it starts to sting, and that's what happened with South Africa. And then what happened was all of these South African companies went to the de Klerk government and said, make it stop, okay? Because apartheid was no longer profitable for them. And that was the turning point. And that's the dynamic that we need to create in Israel.